Hey everyone, and welcome back to Conspiracy Theory Declassified. Tonight we're peeling back the layers on a place where the boundaries of reality were said to have been not just pushed, but shattered. We're heading to the easternmost tip of Long Island, to a decommissioned military base that sits in the shadow of a historic lighthouse, a place where whispers of government overreach blend with tales of monstrous creations and journeys through time itself. We're investigating the Montauk Project. Before we dive into the mystery, if you're as fascinated by the unknown as I am, please hit that like and subscribe button. It helps us find more stories that deserve to be told. Drop a comment below with a mystery you think is due for a new look. All right, turn down the lights, get comfortable, and let's begin our investigation. Imagine you're driving east. You leave the bustling energy of New York City far behind, pushing through the manicured suburbs and then the opulent, sun-drenched towns of the Hamptons. The further you go, the more the land narrows, squeezed between the Atlantic Ocean and the Long Island Sound. The road becomes quieter, the trees thicker, the air heavy with the scent of salt and pine. You are heading for the very end of the island, a place called Montauk Point. It's a place of rugged beauty, of rocky shores and crashing waves. But your destination isn't the famous lighthouse, not directly. It's the land just beside it. A sprawling 754-acre expanse of overgrown forest and crumbling concrete. Camp Hero State Park. As you pull into the park, the first thing you see, the thing you can't possibly miss, is the tower. It rises above the canopy of trees like a concrete leviathan, a silent, unblinking sentinel. It's the ANFPS-35 radar tower, a relic of the Cold War. A structure over 100 feet tall supporting a radar antenna that weighs 40 tons. It hasn't turned in decades, yet its presence is immense, domineering. It feels ancient and futuristic all at once. This tower is your first piece of solid, verifiable truth. This is a real place. Camp Hero was once Montauk Air Force Station, a key part of America's air defense network, tasked with watching the skies for Soviet bombers that never came. The official records, the historical documents all confirm this. This is a well-established fact. The base was commissioned, it operated, and in 1981 it was officially decommissioned. The land was donated to the state for a park in 1984. End of story. But as you step out of your car, you can feel that it's not the end of the story. The wind that whips across the bluff carries more than just the cry of gulls. It carries whispers. You start walking along one of the marked trails, but your eyes are drawn to the things half hidden by nature's patient reclamation. You see concrete bunkers, their entrances sealed with thick slabs of cement or heavy steel plates. You spot rusted ventilation shafts poking out of the earth in the middle of the woods, hinting at structures below. You pass by strange, windowless buildings covered in graffiti, their purpose not immediately clear. They look like utility buildings, but there's a stark, brutalist functionality to them that feels out of place in a state park. You can hear the rhythmic crash of waves against the cliffs below, a constant, soothing sound that contrasts sharply with the unsettling quiet of the base itself. There are no birds singing near the old buildings. The air feels heavy, static, and this is where the lesser-known detail begins to seep into your reality. The fringe theory, the conspiracy. The story is that Camp Hero was just a cover. The real work, the important work, wasn't happening in the barracks or the radar tower you can see. It was happening beneath your feet. The whispers say that Montauk Air Force Station was built on top of an older, deeper base, and that after its official closure, it was secretly expanded into a massive, multi-level subterranean laboratory. A place where scientists, funded by a black budget so deep it was effectively infinite, were conducting experiments that defy our understanding of physics and ethics. They call it the Montauk Project. The story goes that down there, in sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors buried deep in the earth, researchers toyed with the very fabric of human consciousness. They delved into psychological warfare, developing technology to control minds, to implant thoughts, to create emotions from scratch and beam them into unsuspecting populations. They moved beyond the mind and into matter, into space-time itself. They supposedly ripped a hole in the space-time continuum, creating a stable vortex, a time tunnel, that allowed them to travel anywhere in the history or future of our world. And as the darkest versions of the tale claim, they didn't just send trained soldiers through this vortex, they sent children, runaways, abducted kids, expendable lives used as temporal guinea pigs. You stop at a cliff's edge, looking out at the vast gray expanse of the Atlantic. The official story is a decommissioned Air Force base. The conspiracy is a laboratory of horrors. One is documented history, the other is a narrative pieced together from supposed whistleblowers, hypnotically recovered memories, and strange, unverifiable claims. As you stand there, trying to reconcile the peaceful park around you with the horrific stories it supposedly hides, a question begins to form in your mind. How can we ever truly know what happens in the shadows of national security? When a place is deemed vital for the country's defense, when it's wrapped in layers of secrecy and classification, what unsanctioned, unthinkable research might be allowed to fester in the dark, far from public oversight and moral scrutiny? The wind picks up, and for a moment it sounds like voices. You look back at the silent radar tower, a concrete tombstone marking a history we are told is over. But if the stories are true, it's not a tombstone, it's an antenna. An antenna that once broadcasted something far more complex and terrifying than simple radio waves. It broadcasted fear. It broadcasted control. It broadcasted a gateway to another time. And you've only just stepped onto the grounds. To get to the heart of a shadow, you first have to understand the object casting it. Before you can dive into the whispered stories of fractured time and stolen minds, you have to ground yourself in the official history, the one written down in declassified military records and archived photographs. You step back from the cliff's edge, away from the unsettling feelings and the whispers on the wind, and you turn your attention to the facts. The story of Camp Hero and Montauk Air Force Station didn't begin with conspiracies. It began with the very real threat of war. You find that the land's military history starts long before the Cold War. During World War II, this strategic point was known as Fort Hero. Its purpose was simple and vital: coastal defense. You can almost picture it. Young GIs patrolling the bluffs, their eyes scanning the Atlantic horizon not for bombers in the sky, but for the dark silhouettes of German U-boats that terrorize shipping lanes. The base was cleverly disguised. From the air or the sea, it was designed to look like a sleepy New England fishing village. The large concrete bunkers, built to withstand naval bombardment, were hidden beneath fake roofs and painted with phony windows to complete the illusion. This fact alone plants a small seed in your mind. From its very inception, this place was built on a foundation of military deception. It was designed to be something other than what it appeared to be. After the war, the threat changed. The enemy was no longer lurking beneath the waves but soaring miles above the earth. The dawn of the Cold War and the development of Soviet long-range bombers capable of carrying nuclear payloads meant America needed a new kind of defense. It needed a shield. And Montauk Point, jutting out into the Atlantic, was the perfect place for an eye in that shield. In 1951, the U.S. Air Force took control of the site, and Montauk Air Force Station was born. Its mission was surveillance. The centerpiece of this mission is the structure that still dominates the landscape today: the AN/FPS-35 radar. You can find the old, grainy, black and white photos of its construction in the late 1950s. A massive concrete tower rising from the earth, a monument to Cold War paranoia and technological ambition. When it was completed, the massive 120-foot wide antenna was hoisted to the top. This wasn't just any radar. It was a key component of the SAGE system, which stands for Semi-Automatic Ground Environment. This was a revolutionary continent-spanning network of computers and radar installations designed to provide a real-time picture of the sky, detect any incoming threats, and coordinate a defensive response with interceptor jets and surface-to-air missiles. It was the technological marvel of its day. Here you uncover a lesser-known but crucial detail that bridges the gap between the official story and the fringe theories to come. To operate the SAGE system and the colossal AN/FPS-35 radar, the base required an almost unimaginable amount of power. The radar's transmitter alone used several million watts of energy. The computers, filled with thousands of vacuum tubes, generated so much heat, they required their own industrial-scale cooling systems. Montauk Air Force Station couldn't simply plug into the Long Island power grid. It had its own dedicated power plant on site. The entire facility was a self-sufficient, high-energy fortress, built to withstand not just a conventional attack, but the electromagnetic pulse of a nearby nuclear detonation. It housed, by necessity, some of the most advanced and powerful electronic equipment on the planet, all humming away in blast-proof concrete buildings, some of which were partially buried in the earth for protection. For years, this was the rhythm of the base. Hundreds of Air Force personnel lived and worked here, running drills, maintaining the complex machinery, and staring at glowing green screens, watching for blips that could signal the end of the world. It was a place of immense tension and routine boredom, like so many Cold War outposts. The official narrative tells you that this routine continued until technology simply moved on. The primary nuclear threat shifted from bombers to intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs. A missile could cross the ocean in 30 minutes, making the SAGE system's defense against slow-moving aircraft seem quaint and hopelessly outdated. Satellites and more advanced early warning systems took over, so the base began its slow decline. The AN/FPS-35 radar was switched off for the last time in 1981. The station was officially closed. The personnel were transferred. The government, after a few years, donated the bulk of the land to the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. And in 1984, the gates were opened to the public. The story, according to every official source, ends there. A chapter of military history is closed, the site becomes a park, and the old buildings are left to crumble. But you're standing here now, decades later. You've read that clean, logical progression of history. It makes sense. And yet, it doesn't quite line up with the feeling of the place. It doesn't explain the persistent, unsettling rumors that have swirled around it for years. If the base was simply an obsolete radar station, a relic whose only purpose was to watch the skies, then why was so much of its infrastructure built underground? If the story is over and the site is now public land, why do you find so many of those underground entrances not just locked, but sealed with feet of solid concrete, as if to ensure that whatever is down there can never ever be accessed again? The official records provide a clean, sterile timeline of steel, concrete, and purpose. But history isn't just what's written down in government files. It's also what's remembered, what's whispered over bar tops and passed down across generations. Those sealed concrete doors at Camp Hero don't just block physical entry. They create a vacuum, a void in the official narrative. And you find that for decades, local legend and unsettling anecdotes have rushed in to fill that void. To understand the myth of Montauk, you have to leave the park grounds and head into the town itself, a place that has always had a complicated relationship with the secretive base on its doorstep. You find a seat in a local tavern, the kind of place that has been serving fishermen and locals for 50 years. The air smells of salt, beer, and fried clams. You're at the end of the world, geographically speaking, and there's a certain character to the people here. They're pragmatic, tough, and not given to flights of fancy. They've seen real storms, real hardships. So when you start asking about the old days, about what it was like living next to Montauk Air Force Station, you don't expect to hear ghost stories. At first, you don't. The stories start simply, grounded in explainable phenomena. An old man nursing a coffee tells you about the television reception in the 1960s and 70s. He describes how, without warning, the picture on their brand new color TV would dissolve into a blizzard of static. Or even stranger, how channels would change on their own. Radios were the same. You'd be listening to music, and suddenly a deafening squall of noise would erupt from the speakers. Or the dial would seem to drift between stations, picking up faint whispers of conversations that weren't meant to be heard. Most people, he says, just chalked it up to the massive radar. You recall the facts from the official history, the millions of watts of power pulsing from that AN/FPS-35 transmitter. It's a perfectly logical explanation. Of course, a radar that powerful would wreak havoc on primitive 20th century electronics. It's a simple, well-established fact of life next to a high-powered military installation. But you press on, and the stories begin to drift away from the shores of easy explanation. The electronic interference wasn't always just static. Some people talk about their lights flickering in unison with a strange, pulsed rhythm that seemed to emanate from the base. Others tell you about a phenomenon they called the hum, a low-frequency vibration that on certain nights would be felt more than heard, a deep thrumming that rattled windows and seemed to settle deep in your bones. It was a feeling of immense power being unleashed, but a power that had no discernible purpose. The big radar dish, after all, was for watching the sky. What kind of signal resonates in your chest? You hear stranger tales. A woman who grew up on a farm just a few miles from the base describes nights when her father would stand outside, staring towards the station, cursing. The cattle would be spooked, huddled together at the far end of their pasture, as far away from the base as they could get, their eyes wide with a primal fear. No predators, no storm, just a silent, invisible agitation rolling out from Camp Hero. Dogs would refuse to go outside. Birds would vanish from the trees. It was as if the entire animal population was reacting to a threat that humans couldn't perceive. And then there are the stories about the weather. More than one fisherman tells you, with a grim certainty, that the weather around the point was unnatural. Not just unpredictable, which is normal for the coast, but actively strange. They speak of dense, localized fog banks that would appear out of nowhere on a clear day, clinging only to the area around the base. They talk about thunderstorms that would build with incredible speed directly over the station, unleashing furious but brief downpours before dissipating as quickly as they came. It was as if the base itself had its own private and often violent weather system. These are the whispers on the wind. They are not a unified conspiracy theory, not yet. They are a collection of disconnected, anomalous experiences that, for years, had no framework to fit into. They were just Montauk being Montauk. The weird electronic glitches, the spooked animals, the sudden storms, the oppressive hum in the air. For the people who lived here, these were just bizarre quirks of their hometown. But collected together, they paint a picture. It's a fuzzy, impressionistic image of a place that was leaking energy, leaking influence, leaking something that disturbed the natural order of things. As you sit there listening to these decades-old memories, you're faced with a critical question. Are these just the isolated, quirky stories of a small town, easily dismissed as coincidence, mass suggestion, or the embellishments that time adds to any good tale? Or are they data points hinting at a larger, unseen pattern? Perhaps the official story of a radar base is true, but incomplete. Perhaps the routine operations weren't so routine after all. Maybe the millions of watts of power you read about weren't just being aimed at the sky, and the strange effects felt by the town were the side effects. The ripples in the pond from a much larger stone being dropped in the secret underground heart of the base. The disconnected stories of flickering lights, spooked animals, and strange weather in Montauk create an unsettling atmosphere. But they lack a central thread. They are like a series of symptoms without a diagnosis. You find that to connect these dots, to even begin to form a coherent theory about what was happening at the base, you have to look backward. You have to rewind the clock 40 years before the Montauk radar was shut down, to a different coast, a different war, and a different secret experiment that has become one of the most enduring legends in the annals of military conspiracy. To understand Montauk, you first have to hear the story of the Philadelphia experiment. Your investigation takes you to the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard in the thick of World War II. The year is 1943. The world is at war, and the stakes are impossibly high. In the cold, gray waters of the Atlantic, Allied ships are being hunted relentlessly by German U-boats. The Navy is desperate for any advantage, any technological leap that could turn the tide. According to the legend, this desperation gave birth to a project of unprecedented ambition and secrecy, a project known as Project Rainbow. Its goal was something straight out of science fiction, to make a warship completely invisible. Not just camouflaged, not just hidden, but truly electromagnetically invisible to enemy radar and, perhaps even to the naked eye. The scientific foundation for this audacious goal was supposedly a practical application of Albert Einstein's unified field theory, the elusive theory that sought to unite the forces of electromagnetism and gravity. The story goes that by generating immense and precisely configured electromagnetic fields, researchers believed they could bend light and radio waves around an object, rendering it undetectable. The test subject for this theory was a very real vessel, a fact which gives the story its anchor in reality. The ship was the USS Eldridge, a Cannon-class destroyer escort. Public records confirm its existence, its commissioning in August 1943, and its service in the war. The official story is that its career was unremarkable. The legend tells a different tale. You imagine the scene on October 28, 1943. The USS Eldridge sits moored at the dock, massive electrical cables snaking across its deck connected to a series of powerful generators on shore. A select group of military top brass and scientists, perhaps even Einstein himself according to some tellings, watch from a safe distance. The order is given. The generators hum to life, their sound rising to a deafening crescendo. An eerie greenish-blue glow begins to envelop the destroyer. A strange, thick fog materializes out of thin air, shrouding the ship from view. Then, the impossible happens. The ship disappears. It doesn't just vanish from radar screens, it vanishes from sight. One moment, a 200-ton steel warship is there, displacing water in the Delaware River. The next, there's nothing but an empty slip, the water churning where the Eldridge had just been. But the story doesn't end with simple invisibility. What happened next, according to the lore, went far beyond the project's intent. The ship was ripped from the very fabric of space-time. For several minutes, it is said to have materialized in the waters off Norfolk, Virginia, over 200 miles away. It was reportedly seen by sailors aboard the civilian merchant ship SS Andrew Furuseth, who watched in stunned disbelief as the ghostly green-tinged warship appeared and then vanished again. It reappeared back in the Philadelphia shipyard, right where it had been. But when the generators were finally powered down and the sickening green fog dissipated, the true horror of the experiment was revealed. The project was a success, but at a cost that no one had calculated. The effect on the human crew was catastrophic. You find accounts, passed down through letters and third-hand testimony, that describe a grotesque and terrifying scene. Some sailors were found fused into the very structure of the ship, their bodies and limbs partially embedded in the steel bulkheads and deck plates, caught between states of matter. Others had gone violently insane, shrieking in terror at things only they could see. Some were simply gone, vanished entirely. A few of the survivors were said to be afflicted with a horrifying after effect. They would spontaneously and uncontrollably fade from view, becoming invisible and intangible for minutes or hours at a time, before reappearing, a phenomenon that eventually drove them to madness or death. The Navy, faced with a disaster of this magnitude, did what secretive organizations do best. They buried it. The project was immediately shut down. The Eldridge's logs were altered. The surviving crew were silenced, discharged for psychological reasons, or locked away. The official story became that nothing ever happened, but you uncover the central thesis that connects this horror story to the whispers on Long Island. The research didn't stop. The knowledge of how to manipulate reality with electromagnetic fields was too powerful to abandon. It was simply taken off the books and moved into the shadows, where it would continue for decades, evolving, being refined. This is the alleged genesis of the Montauk Project. It was the rebirth of Project Rainbow. And it raises a chilling question. Could it be that the bizarre events at Montauk weren't a new phenomenon, but the renewed echoes of a terrible discovery made 40 years earlier? A discovery the government was desperate to understand and control? Suddenly the stories from the locals take on a new, more sinister meaning. The electronic interference, the localized storms. The hum, were these the side effects of a new generation of scientists working in a secure, isolated base, cautiously turning the dials on the same terrifying machine that had once torn a hole in the world back in 1943. The shadow of the USS Eldridge, it seems, stretches all the way to the lighthouse at Montauk Point. A legend as potent and terrifying as the Philadelphia experiment cannot remain a ghost story forever. For it to evolve, for it to connect to the strange whispers emanating from the tip of Long Island, it needs a human bridge. It needs a voice. It needs someone to step out of the shadows and say, "I was there, I know what happened." For years, the stories were disconnected fragments, but in the late 1980s, you discover that such a voice did emerge. You come across the work of an electrical engineer named Preston B. Nichols, and you realize that he is the patient zero of the Montauk Project conspiracy as we know it today. You find his book, first published in 1992, titled The Montauk Project: Experiments in Time, It's a slim volume, but its contents are explosive. In it, Nichols presents himself not as a detached investigator, but as a direct participant, a whistleblower whose own memories were the primary evidence. This is a crucial distinction. The story he tells isn't one he uncovered, it's one he claims to have lived. On the surface, Preston Nichols seems like a credible source. He's a man of science with a degree in electrical engineering. He lists an impressive resume, claiming to have worked for well-respected Long Island defense and science institutions like Brookhaven National Laboratory and Eaton Corporation. He is, by his own account, an expert in the field of electromagnetism, the very force at the heart of the Philadelphia experiment. This is the established, verifiable fact of his background. He is a real person with real credentials, who wrote a real book. His story, however, quickly departs from the world of conventional science. It begins, he says, not with a dramatic revelation, but with a persistent technical problem. While working on his own psychic research, attempting to scientifically prove the existence of telepathy, he kept encountering interference. A strange radio signal at 435 megahertz kept appearing, disrupting his sensitive equipment. It would turn on and off in a precise, repeating 20-second cycle. It was structured, artificial, and deeply annoying. Being an engineer, Nichols decided to trace the source. Using a sophisticated antenna array, he triangulated the signal, and the hunt led him, to his own surprise, directly to the giant, decommissioned AN/FPS-35 radar dish at Camp Hero. The base was supposed to be shuttered, a dead relic, and yet, here was a powerful rhythmic signal pulsing from its heart. You can feel the narrative connecting back to the local legends. The strange electronic chaos the townspeople had reported for years. Nichols was now documenting it, a specific frequency, a specific location. But this is where his journey takes a sharp turn from technical investigation into the deeply personal and paranormal. At this same time in his life, Nichols claims he was a mess. He was having blackouts, experiencing huge gaps in his memory. He'd find strange items in his apartment or have people greet him as if they knew him well, while he had no memory of them at all. It felt, he said, like another person was living his life when he wasn't looking. On the advice of a friend, he reluctantly agrees to see a psychic. As he tells it, this meeting shatters his world. The psychic takes one look at him and tells him that she sees two distinct energies, two personalities. One is the man sitting in front of her. The other, she says, is a darker, more scientific persona that has been artificially suppressed, hidden behind a powerful mental block. She tells him point blank that he's been involved in a secret traumatic project and that his handlers regularly wipe his memory. She looks him in the eye and says the word that will change his life: Montauk. This single word, he claims, was the key. It was the crack in the dam of his carefully constructed reality, the technical mystery of the radio signal, his own fractured personal life, and now this psychic pronouncement all collided. He began driving out to Montauk, sitting in his car, just looking at the base. And slowly, painfully, the memories started to return. Not as a clear narrative, but as disturbing flashes: the smell of ozone and damp concrete, the flicker of fluorescent lights in a long corridor, the face of a terrified young boy, the feeling of immense vibrating power from a strange machine. He claims to have recovered an entire second life. In this other life, he wasn't just Preston Nichols, the Long Island engineer. He was Dr. Preston Nichols, a senior technician in a vast, secret underground laboratory beneath Camp Hero. He remembered his job: managing the complex electronic interface between a powerful transmitter, exotic antenna systems, and a psychic. He remembered working day and night on projects that his conscious mind would have dismissed as impossible. It all came flooding back, an alternate history of his own life that had been violently carved out of his consciousness. And here you are, holding this incredible testimony in your hands. It's the Rosetta Stone for all the disparate strangeness surrounding Montauk, but it also presents you with a profound and difficult question. When a story is this fantastic, built not on documents but on memories that were supposedly erased and then recovered, where do you draw the line between a genuine repressed experience and the human mind's incredible capacity to create a narrative to explain the unexplainable? Is Nichols remembering a real buried past? Or did his scientific mind, faced with anomalous radio waves and a fractured psyche, simply construct the most elaborate explanation imaginable? Your entire investigation now hinges on the reliability of this one man's tormented memory. Preston Nichols' story of recovered memories was a bombshell, cracking open the official history of Montauk Air Force Station to reveal a potential abyss of secret research beneath. But as you continue your investigation, you find that he wasn't alone for long. His public testimony seemed to act like a tuning fork, resonating with something buried in the minds of others, allegedly shaking loose their own suppressed memories of the impossible. And the most significant, most bizarre, and most reality-shattering of these emerging stories belongs to a man named Al Bielek. If Preston Nichols opened the door to Montauk, Al Bielek claims to have jumped through it from 40 years in the past. You find the videotaped interviews and conference lectures from the late 1980s and early 90s. There you see Al Bielek, a calm, articulate man, an engineer by trade just like Nichols, who lays out his life story with a steady, convincing sincerity that is completely at odds with the content of his tale. His testimony doesn't just support the Montauk Project narrative, it intertwines it completely with the legend of the Philadelphia experiment, making them two sides of the same temporal coin. These public appearances are a well-established fact. Al Bielek and another man, Duncan Cameron, were real people who made these claims openly and repeatedly, often sharing a stage with Preston Nichols. Bielek's story begins with a stunning assertion. He is not who he thinks he is. He claims his entire life as Alfred Bielek is an artificial reality, a cover identity implanted in his mind. His true name, he insists, was Edward Cameron, born in 1916. He had a younger brother, Duncan Cameron, born in 1917. As brilliant young physicists, they were recruited into the Navy's most secret wartime project. You realize with a jolt that he's talking about Project Rainbow. Al Bielek, or Edward Cameron, claims that he and his brother were physically on the deck of the USS Eldridge on that fateful day in October 1943. He describes the experiment from a first-person perspective. The nauseating green fog, the hum of the generators building to an unbearable intensity, the feeling of reality itself becoming soft and pliable. He speaks of a rising panic among the crew as the ship began to dematerialize. Fearing for their lives, he and his brother Duncan made a split-second decision. They jumped. But they didn't hit the cold water of the Philadelphia shipyard. According to Bielek, the moment they cleared the ship's railing, they were sucked into a vortex, a swirling tunnel of light and energy. They were thrown through time. They landed hard in the dead of night, on the grounds of a military base they didn't recognize, surrounded by strange technology and armed guards. After being taken into custody, they were introduced to the project's leader, an elderly man who introduced himself as Dr. John von Neumann, the brilliant mathematician who had also, according to legend, worked on the original Philadelphia experiment. Von Neumann, who historically died in 1957, was supposedly still alive and well, having been part of the secret project for its entire duration. He explained to the shocked brothers that it was no longer 1943. The date was August 12, 1983. They were at Montauk Air Force Station. They had traveled exactly 40 years into the future. The story grows even more tangled. Von Neumann explained that the Montauk project, the descendant of their own experiment, was in a state of crisis. The high-energy tests being conducted in 1983 had unexpectedly locked onto the original experiment in 1943, creating a dangerous and unstable wormhole between the two time periods. The only way to sever the link was to shut down the 1943 experiment. And the only way to do that was to send the brothers back to destroy the equipment on the Eldridge. After being sent back and completing their mission, the timeline was supposedly secured. But the overseers of the project now had a problem. Two men who had seen the future, who knew the entire history of a secret that spanned half a century. They couldn't be allowed to simply walk away. Duncan, the younger brother, was, according to the story, regressed in time and his soul placed into the body of a new baby born to a different family, also coincidentally named Cameron. For Edward, Al Bielek's original self, the solution was even more extreme. He claims he was subjected to a deeply classified and esoteric technology that could de-age the human body. He was physically regressed year by year, until he became an infant. His memories were wiped, and this new baby, with the soul of Edward Cameron, was placed with the Bielik family in 1927 to be raised as their son, Alfred. He lived a full, normal life with no knowledge of his past until 1988, when he watched the sci-fi film, The Philadelphia Experiment. The movie, he claims, triggered uncontrollable flashes of memory. This led him on a quest, through therapy and hypnotic regression, that ultimately unearthed the entire staggering story of his true identity. And the final crucial piece of the puzzle, the primary psychic operator of the Montauk chair, the man Preston Nichols remembered working with, was none other than his own brother, Duncan Cameron, living out his new life, his own powerful abilities being used by the very project that had torn their original lives apart. You are now faced with a narrative of such profound strangeness that it tests the very limits of belief. It's a story that requires you to accept not just secret government projects, but time travel, age regression, and the transmigration of souls as established technologies. And this raises a serious question about the nature of evidence. When a story involves time travel, age regression, and soul swapping, it defies all known laws of physics. At what point does a personal testimony, no matter how detailed or passionately delivered, become so extraordinary that it requires an equally extraordinary level of proof before it can be considered, even for a moment? The fantastic life stories of Preston Nichols and Al Bielek, with their tales of suppressed memories and time-traveling brothers, are built around a central, pivotal figure, the psychic Duncan Cameron. But in the cold, pragmatic world of secret military projects, a person with abilities is merely a component. To become a tool or a weapon, that ability needs to be focused, quantified, and amplified on an industrial scale. And that, you learn, was the alleged purpose of the project's dark crown jewel, the technological heart of the entire conspiracy, the Montauk chair. To understand the chair, you delve back into Preston Nichols' recovered memories, which are filled with the specific, technical-sounding details you might expect from an electrical engineer. He describes the device not as a single object, but as the nexus of a complex and powerful system, housed in a heavily shielded room deep in the subterranean levels of the base. This room, he claims, was a Faraday cage within a Faraday cage, multiple layers of steel designed to block any stray electromagnetic signals from getting in or out. In the center of this sterile, isolated chamber sat the chair. You try to visualize it based on his descriptions. It's not a sinister electric chair from an old movie. It's more clinical, like a piece of advanced medical equipment. It's a comfortable-looking recliner, but it's surrounded by a strange-looking assembly of coils and sensors. There are large coils positioned at various angles around the chair, and a helmet-like device that would be lowered over the operator's head, studded with intricate sensors. Wires run from this entire assembly to a nearby bank of state-of-the-art computers. Nichols specifies a Cray-1 supercomputer, a real and legendary machine from that era, known for its immense processing power. The purpose of this setup was, in theory, breathtakingly simple and, in practice, impossibly complex. It was designed to read a thought. When the psychic operator, most often Duncan Cameron, sat in the chair and entered a deep meditative state, focusing his mind on a specific object, a place, or even an emotion, the sensitive coils would pick up the faint, unique electromagnetic signature of that thought directly from his brain. This raw neural signal would then be fed to the Cray-1 supercomputer, which would act as a universal translator, converting the chaotic language of the human mind into a clean, structured digital code. This part of the process, while advanced, still sits within the realm of theoretical science. But the next step is where the Montauk chair allegedly made the leap into pure, terrifying magic. The digital signal, the very essence of a thought, was then passed to the transmitter. And here you find the project's link to the visible historical hardware of the base. The conspiracy claims that the scientists didn't build a new transmitter, they repurposed the old one. This is the well-established fact you can verify. Montauk Air Force Station was home to the SAGE radar's incredibly powerful transmitter, a marvel of 1950s engineering built by the company RCA. This machine was capable of generating millions of watts of power, enough to broadcast a signal for hundreds of miles. Nichols claims they took this Cold War behemoth and modified it, turning it from a device that bounces waves off airplanes into a machine that could broadcast a thought. The thought, now a digital signal, was used to modulate the transmitter's multi-megawatt output. The raw power of the SAGE system was now being shaped, molded into the form of a human idea. But where did this signal go? It wasn't beamed from the giant dish on the surface for the whole world to see. Nichols describes a different, and much more secret, piece of hardware. Buried deep in the earth, beneath the transmitter building, was a massive non-conventional antenna array he calls the Delta T antenna. The T stands for time. He describes it as a massive hollow octahedron, a complex set of coils oriented in a specific, almost mystical geometry, designed to manipulate the very fabric of space-time. So you have the complete system. A psychic's thought is captured by a chair, translated by a supercomputer, vastly amplified by a repurposed Cold War radar transmitter, and then broadcast through a subterranean antenna specifically designed to warp reality. It's a machine built to make thoughts real, and it leads you to a genuinely profound scientific question. If the human mind can generate a measurable electrical signal, however faint, what is the theoretical limit of amplifying that signal? We amplify sound 1,000,000 times to fill a stadium. We amplify light into a focused beam that can cut through steel. At what point does advanced technology become indistinguishable from magic? And could a machine truly be built to bridge the gap between a thought and physical reality? The story of the Montauk chair insists that for a few years, in a concrete bunker buried under the sand of Long Island, that bridge was not only built, but crossed. The claim that a machine could be built to read, amplify, and broadcast a human thought is staggering enough on its own. It sits on the farthest edge of scientific possibility. But the stories that emerged from Preston Nichols and the other whistleblowers go much further. They don't just describe the blueprint of this impossible machine. They give you the lab notes. They tell you what happened when it was finally turned on. The initial goal, you learn, was not to travel through time or manifest monsters. The first experiments were simpler, more fundamental. They were just trying to prove the concept. Could a thought, projected from the Montauk chair, leave a footprint on reality? According to Nichols's account, the first tests were tentative, almost cautious. Duncan Cameron would be seated in the chair, the massive transmitter powered up to only a fraction of its capacity. The first task was simple object manifestation. The scientists would give Duncan a target. Visualize a solid white pyramid. In his meditative state, Duncan would focus all his mental energy on that single geometric thought. Elsewhere on the base, in a secure, monitored room, other researchers would watch and wait. The stories claim that they were successful. A shimmering, ethereal outline of a pyramid would appear in the middle of the room. It wasn't solid. You could pass your hand through it. It was like a hologram made of static, and it would flicker and vanish within moments. But it was there. A thought had been given a three-dimensional form, miles away from the mind that conceived it. They refined the process. They found that for a thought to manifest accurately at a specific location, the psychic needed a witness, a physical object connecting him to the target. A photograph of the room, a piece of material from the location, or in more sinister applications, a lock of hair from a target person. With a witness, the connection became clearer, the manifestations stronger. But projecting ghostly shapes had limited applications. The project's true goal, you discover, was far more ambitious, and it aligns perfectly with a well-established and documented aspect of military science: psychological operations, or PSYOPs. Militaries have always sought to influence the minds and emotions of their enemies and even their own populations. Propaganda leaflets, radio broadcasts, disinformation campaigns, these are the crude early tools. The Montauk Project allegedly was developing the ultimate PSYOPs weapon. The experiments shifted from sight to the other senses. Instead of an object, Duncan would be instructed to focus on a pure sensation: the bitter taste of coffee, the smell of gunpowder, the sound of a ringing telephone. The transmitter would broadcast this sensory data, not to a specific room but over a wider area, the base itself, or even the nearby town of Montauk. The results, as the story goes, were subtle but undeniable. A guard patrolling the perimeter would suddenly be overwhelmed by the smell of burning leaves on a clear spring day. A secretary typing in an office would flinch at the distinct sound of a phone ringing that no one else could hear. Having mastered sensory projection, they moved on to the primary target: emotion. This is where the experiments took a deeply unethical turn, transforming the nearby town into an unwilling laboratory. Duncan would be directed to focus on raw, powerful emotions. On a quiet Tuesday, he would project intense, unreasoning fear. On a Thursday, waves of profound depression. On a weekend, irritability and anger. The project's observers, supposedly placed throughout the community, would then collect the data. They would note a sudden, inexplicable spike in traffic accidents. They would record an unusual number of bar fights or domestic disturbances. They would hear reports of a general malaise, a gloom that settled over the town for a few hours with no apparent cause. The disconnected, strange feelings the locals had whispered about for years. You now see them reframed as the direct, calculated results of these emotional broadcasts. The power and precision of the technology allegedly grew until they reached a final, almost godlike stage of mind control: the manipulation of probability itself. Nichols claimed they could make the chair broadcast not just an emotion, but a complex thought, a command to reality. For example, Duncan would visualize the thought, "All the glass windows on Main Street will shatter." The chair would broadcast this intent, and while the thought itself couldn't directly break glass, it could subtly nudge the world to make it happen. A flight of military jets would be rerouted nearby, and their sonic boom, at that precise moment, would provide the physical force. A sudden freak hailstorm might materialize over that one specific street. The project, in its most advanced form, was no longer just influencing minds. It was writing scripts for reality to follow. You're left to contemplate the terrifying implications of such a weapon, and it forces you to ask a deeply personal question. How many of your daily emotions or sudden impulses are truly your own? If a technology existed that could subtly influence your mood or plant a fleeting thought in your head, a thought that you would immediately rationalize as your own, would you even be able to tell? The stories from Montauk suggest that for a time, at least one community was subjected to this. Their very free will treated as a variable in a horrific experiment. They had proven they could project a thought. The next logical step was to see if they could project something more substantial. The power to project thoughts, to influence emotions, to nudge the very fabric of probability from a distance. This was a monumental, if terrifying, achievement. But the ambition of the project's shadowy overseers, you learn, went even further. One gifted natural psychic like Duncan Cameron was a proof of concept, but he was also a single point of failure. To truly operationalize their technology, they needed more operators. They needed a core of psychics they could control completely. And the methods they allegedly used to recruit this core represent the moral event horizon of the entire Montauk story. This is the chapter of the Montauk Boys. As you dig into the darkest claims of the whistleblowers, you uncover a narrative that shifts from unethical science to outright atrocity. The project needed a specific type of raw material: young, impressionable minds whose psychic potential was still fluid and untapped. They needed subjects who were, for all intents and purposes, blank slates, and they knew exactly where to find them. Here, the story collides with a tragic and well-established fact of American society in the 1970s and 80s. This was the era of the milk carton kids, a time when there was a significant and heartbreaking national crisis of runaway and homeless youth. Thousands of children fleeing abuse or poverty ended up on the streets of major urban centers. They were vulnerable, desperate, and, most importantly to the project, they were invisible. They lived in the cracks of society, and if one of them vanished, who would notice? Who would care? New York City, just a few hours' drive from Montauk, was allegedly the primary hunting ground. The story, as told by Preston Nichols and others who claim to have witnessed it, is chillingly systematic. Recruiters, believed to be military intelligence agents in street clothes, would patrol places where these children gathered: bus terminals, city parks, shelters. They weren't looking for just anyone. They supposedly had a specific profile in mind, based on esoteric and occult beliefs about psychic lineage. Blonde, blue-eyed children of Northern European descent were considered prime candidates. They were looking for boys, mostly, between the ages of 10 and 16. Once a target was identified, they would be approached, lured with promises of food and shelter, or simply abducted. They would be drugged, loaded into an unmarked van, and driven out to the eastern end of Long Island. Their final destination was the secret underground entrance to the Montauk base. For these children, the sunlit world of the state park above was a reality they would never see again. What awaited them below was a systematic and brutal process of psychological demolition. You uncover descriptions of a conditioning program that mirrors the darkest allegations of the CIA's infamous MK-Ultra project. The goal was to erase the child's existing personality completely, to break them down to their very foundations so they could be rebuilt as a programmable tool. The methods were a catalog of horrors. The children were allegedly subjected to massive doses of psychedelic drugs, sensory deprivation, extreme physical and emotional trauma, and relentless hypnotic programming. Their identities were systematically dismantled, their memories wiped, their sense of self annihilated. They were given new names, or just numbers. Those who survived this monstrous process, and the stories insist that many did not, emerged as something other than human children. They were described as empty shells, their eyes vacant, their emotions blunted, but with one key difference: their latent psychic abilities, which had made them targets in the first place, were now raw, exposed, and immensely powerful. Their minds were now open channels, capable of interfacing directly with the Montauk chair, but devoid of the individual will that might resist a command. These children, the so-called Montauk boys, became the project's primary psychic fuel. They were the expendable pilots for the most dangerous and demanding experiments. They were allegedly put in the chair for hours on end, their mental energies used for everything from psychic spying on enemy targets to powering exotic technology. They were, according to the whistleblowers, treated with less care than a piece of lab equipment. If an experiment went wrong, if a psychic projection was too powerful and caused a fatal aneurysm, or if a subject was driven into a permanent catatonic state, the loss was considered acceptable. The recruiters would simply be sent back to the city for a replacement. This allegation, more than any other, forces a grim and deeply unsettling question. In the name of national security, how far is too far? If a secret project believed it could change the course of human history, secure ultimate power, or win a war before it even started, would it hesitate to sacrifice those living on the margins of society, the ones nobody would even notice were gone? The story of the Montauk boys suggests that this moral line was not just crossed but erased, deep beneath the ground at the end of Long Island. The creation of a disposable psychic army, as horrifying as it is to contemplate, was not the endgame. It was a means to an end. With a roster of traumatized, programmable operators and a perfected mind broadcasting technology, the Montauk project allegedly moved from experimentation to military application. The bizarre science that began with projecting ghostly pyramids in a locked room was about to be forged into weapons of war, weapons that could strike anywhere on the planet without leaving a single physical trace. To understand this leap, you have to look at the historical context of the Cold War. It might sound like pure fiction, but the concept of psychic warfare was a subject of intense and very real interest for both the United States and the Soviet Union. You can find declassified documents on programs like Project Stargate, the CIA and U.S. Army's official, multi-million-dollar effort to train military personnel in remote viewing, the ability to psychically see a location from thousands of miles away. This is a well-established fact. The American intelligence community was genuinely exploring the potential of psychic phenomena for espionage and warfare. The story of Montauk, then, isn't that they were interested in these things. It's that they had allegedly perfected them to a degree that Stargate's remote viewers could only dream of. The first and most direct weaponization, according to the whistleblowers' accounts, was electronic disruption. You imagine a scenario based on their claims. A joint military training exercise is taking place in the Atlantic. Deep beneath Camp Hero, one of the Montauk boys, a teenager stripped of his name and identity, is placed in the chair. He is given a photograph and a technical schematic of a specific guided missile aboard one of the ships. His handler gives him a simple command: see the guidance system. see it failing. The boy focuses his traumatized, amplified mind on the image of melting circuits. The Montauk chair translates this thought into a complex waveform. The Sage transmitter blasts it with millions of watts of power, and the Delta T antenna focuses it on the target miles away. Aboard the ship, the missile's diagnostic panel suddenly flashes red. A critical component has inexplicably failed. The test is a wash. The failure is logged as a random hardware malfunction, a ghost in the machine that no one can explain. From disrupting machines, they allegedly moved to disrupting minds. They developed a technique that was referred to as the mind wrench. This was the system's sniper rifle. Instead of a wide emotional broadcast, the chair's output would be focused into a tight, invisible beam aimed at a single individual. The target could be an enemy commander, a hostile political leader, or a scientist working on a rival project. The operator in the chair wouldn't project a complex thought, just raw, debilitating sensation. The feeling of a blinding migraine, a wave of intense vertigo and nausea, sheer, crippling panic. The target, sitting in their office a continent away, would suddenly collapse, clutching their head in agony or overcome by a nameless terror. Doctors would find nothing wrong. A psychiatrist might diagnose a stress-induced breakdown, the perfect, untraceable assassination. But the project's true strategic potential lay in its ultimate psyops capability: mass behavioral control. The localized emotion broadcasts they tested on the town of Montauk were just the beginning. The story goes that they began to aim this technology at global hotspots. Imagine a nation on the brink of a revolution that isn't in America's interest. From Montauk, a signal is broadcast, a wave of lethargy, apathy, and gentle contentment. The revolutionary fervor on the streets mysteriously subsides. The protests shrink, the movement loses its momentum, and the populace becomes strangely accepting of the status quo. Conversely, if they wanted to stir the pot, they could broadcast agitation and paranoia. The possibilities were endless: quelling riots, manufacturing consent for an unpopular policy, destabilizing a foreign government by making its people fearful and suspicious. It was a tool to engineer society on a global scale. This level of influence required flawless intelligence, and the chair was allegedly used for that as well. By reversing the polarity of the system, it could become the ultimate listening device. An operator could be given a target, the Kremlin, a secret Chinese military base, and the chair would create a psychic link, allowing the operator to see and hear everything happening at that location as if they were there. It was remote viewing, but amplified 1,000 times, a perfect and undetectable form of espionage. You are left to consider the nature of conflict in the 21st century. In a world of cyber attacks and information warfare, what would the ultimate stealth weapon look like? Could a war be fought and won, not on a battlefield with bombs and bullets, but in the consciousness of the population, with the loser never even knowing they were attacked? The whistleblowers claim that Montauk developed exactly that capability. They had in effect mastered the psychological battlefield. But this unprecedented power over the present was apparently not enough. It was merely a stepping stone toward the project's final and most audacious goal: the complete mastery of time itself. Having achieved the ability to project thought across space to disable a missile or sway a crowd from a bunker on Long Island, the next question for the Montauk scientists was as logical as it was terrifying. Could they do the same thing across time? Their mastery of the psychological and physical present was, in their eyes, complete. The only frontier left to conquer was time itself, and so the project's focus began to shift from psychotronics to temporal mechanics, turning its awesome technology inward, toward the very fabric of the fourth dimension. The initial goal, you learn, was not to physically travel through time. That was considered far too dangerous and unpredictable. The first phase was simply an extension of their remote viewing program. Instead of giving Duncan Cameron a geographical coordinate as a target, they would give him a temporal one. See London, April 15, 1912, the night the Titanic sank. See the signing of the Declaration of Independence, July 4, 1776. Duncan, sitting in the Montauk chair, would use his amplified abilities to project his consciousness, his point of view, backward or forward in time, acting as a living psychic time camera. The theoretical science they were allegedly working from has a surprising anchor in real-world physics. You find that the concept of a wormhole, a theoretical shortcut through the fabric of spacetime, is a genuine solution to the equations of Einstein's theory of general relativity. First proposed as an Einstein-Rosen bridge, a wormhole is a hypothetical topological feature that could, in theory, connect two distant points in spacetime, creating a bridge between locations or even between moments in time. To mainstream science, it remains a purely mathematical curiosity, likely impossible to create or sustain. To the scientists at Montauk, according to the legend, it became a blueprint. You imagine the scene in the underground control room during the pivotal experiment. It starts like any other temporal viewing session. Duncan is in the chair, wired and focused. Preston Nichols is at his engineering console monitoring the energy feeds from the transmitter. The senior researchers are watching the data streams from Duncan's brainwaves. The target for the day is given. Duncan closes his eyes and focuses, his mind reaching across the decades. But this time, something is different. On the monitors, the energy readings begin to fluctuate wildly, then spike to levels they have never seen before. Duncan's brainwave patterns, usually fluid, lock into a strange, rigid, repeating waveform. He's not just observing the target time anymore. He's latched onto it. In his account, Nichols describes a palpable tension in the room. Duncan is unresponsive. His consciousness is tethered to another point in time, and the scientists realize they can't break the connection. His mind, amplified by the chair, has done something unexpected. It has ceased to be a simple receiver and has become a beacon, a psychic anchor creating a stable, resonant link between his present location in 1982 and the target time. He has, through sheer mental force, created a psychic wormhole. At this moment of crisis, one of the lead scientists has a flash of terrifying insight. He sees the open psychic channel not as a problem, but as a conduit, an opportunity. He gives a command that will forever alter the course of the project. The full, multi-megawatt power of the SAGE transmitter is to be rerouted. Instead of being broadcast out into the world, its entire RF energy output is to be pumped directly into the stable psychic pathway Duncan's mind is holding open. They were going to use millions of watts of raw power to pry open a psychic connection and see if it could be made physical. You can almost feel the ground shake as the order is carried out. The lights in the bunker dim as the capacitors of the massive transmitter discharge their load. A deep, resonant hum vibrates through the concrete walls. In the main experimental chamber, where the subterranean Delta-T antenna is housed, the air begins to ionize, crackling with a pale blue light. The air directly over the antenna starts to shimmer, like the heat haze off summer asphalt. The shimmering coalesces, twisting in on itself. Then, with a sound like tearing fabric, the space itself rips open. The whistleblowers all describe what appeared in the same way. It wasn't a flat, shimmering portal like in the movies. It was a tunnel, a swirling vortex of light and color that seemed to recede into an impossible distance. It had a distinct corkscrew-like structure, as if you were looking down a spiral staircase that was rotating in on itself. The walls of the tunnel were not smooth but flickered with distorted images, glimpses of other places and other times. The entrance to this vortex, however, was a stable, circular opening, roughly 10 feet in diameter, hovering in the air a few feet off the floor. It hummed with a contained immense power. They had done it. Whether by accident or design, they had torn a hole in the universe. And this breakthrough presents you with a chilling question about the nature of discovery. When you are pushing the boundaries of known science, how do you prepare for a result you never even conceived was possible? And when an accident opens a door that should have remained closed, is the temptation to step through it too great for human curiosity to resist? Staring at the impossible humming vortex, the scientists at Montauk now had a physical gateway to anywhere and anywhen. The door was open. The only question left was what they would dare to send through it. The open vortex, humming with impossible energy in the depths of the Montauk base, was a sight of terrible and beautiful temptation. For the scientists, it was the culmination of their life's work. But for the project's secret military overseers, it was not a scientific curiosity. It was the ultimate strategic asset, a tool that could render all other forms of intelligence gathering obsolete. The era of mere observation from their own time was over. The era of direct intervention had begun. Yet even in their alleged recklessness, there was a method. You learn that they didn't immediately start sending people through the swirling, unstable gateway. The first forays into the time stream were robotic. They would send in remote-controlled probes, tethered with cables that spooled out into the vortex, equipped with cameras and environmental sensors. The first grainy, distorted images of other times and places would flicker onto the screens in the control room. They sent probes back a few hours to confirm the tunnel's accuracy. They sent them forward a day to see if the future was fixed. They tested the air on the other side for contaminants, for radiation, for any sign that the traveler would be instantly killed upon arrival. Once the tunnel was deemed survivable, the question of who to send first was answered with the same cold, pragmatic cruelty that had defined the project's darkest phase. The first human chrononauts, the first true time travelers in human history, were allegedly the Montauk boys. They were the expendable assets, the children conditioned to obey without question. Their first missions were short, terrifying look-sees. A boy would be ordered to step into the vortex tethered by a safety line and emerge just a few hundred feet away but 10 minutes in the future. He would then be pulled back, debriefed on what he saw, confirming that the future was for that moment stable. Another would be sent a day into the past, with strict orders not to be seen, a ghost from tomorrow walking the halls of the base from yesterday. After sacrificing an unknown number of these children to the temporal instabilities and unknown dangers of the tunnel, the process was considered acceptably safe for trained, adult operatives. A new, top-secret unit was formed, composed of military special forces and intelligence agents who were subjected to their own intense psychological screening and conditioning. They were the project's elite, the men and women who would walk the corridors of history. Their alleged missions read like a catalog of humanity's greatest hits and darkest hours. The goal was intelligence, verification, and sometimes acquisition. A team might be sent back to the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, not to change the outcome, but to observe Confederate tactics firsthand, and perhaps retrieve a period rifle for metallurgical analysis. Another mission, central to the project's own mythology, was to go back to 1943 to observe the Philadelphia experiment from the docks, trying to get an objective view of what truly happened to the USS Eldridge. They became ghosts in their own history, gathering data that no historian could ever dream of. The journeys into the future were even more critical. Operatives were sent forward in increments, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, to map out the probable timeline of humanity. The reports they brought back, as recounted by Al Bielek, were bleak. They allegedly saw the aftermath of devastating global conflicts, coastlines altered by environmental catastrophes, and major cities under the control of new authoritarian world governments. One of the most detailed accounts speaks of a mission sent centuries forward, arriving in a dead, decaying city filled with monumental statues, where the only signs of life were robotic probes still patrolling the ruins. The information gathered from these future timelines was allegedly considered the most valuable intelligence on Earth, shaping government policy in the present in ways the public could never imagine. But this was not clean or easy work. Time, the stories insist, is a hazardous and violent ocean. The vortex was not always stable. Teams would enter the tunnel on a routine mission and their signals would simply vanish, lost forever between the ticks of the clock. Sometimes an operative would return, but changed. A man who had been inside for what he perceived as 20 minutes would emerge aged 20 years, his body ravaged by temporal shear. Others came back psychologically shattered, their minds broken by witnessing paradoxical events or seeing things so far outside human experience that they were driven mad. The price for a ticket to yesterday or tomorrow was perilously high. And as you absorb these incredible stories of temporal exploration, a fundamental ethical question emerges, the classic dilemma of all time travel fiction. If you had the power to witness any moment in history, could you truly remain just an observer? What would be the temptation to intervene, to whisper a warning, to save a life, to alter a terrible mistake? And what unforeseen consequences What catastrophic ripples could spread forward from a single well-intentioned act? The official mission was to watch, not to touch, but with the fate of the past and future in their hands, you are left to wonder how long that rule could possibly have lasted. The high cost of physical time travel, lost teams, broken minds, the ever-present danger of paradox, forced the Montauk scientists to seek a safer, more efficient alternative. Sending a team of armed operatives into the past was a loud, messy, and unpredictable affair. It was the temporal equivalent of a full-scale invasion. But most of the time, they didn't need to invade. They just needed to look. They needed a peephole. They needed a window into any moment in time, a way to conduct passive reconnaissance without risking lives or the integrity of the timeline. This desire for a passive viewing system, you discover, is not unique to the Montauk story. The idea of a time viewer is a recurring theme in fringe science and conspiracy lore. You uncover tales of the alleged chronovisor, a device supposedly built in secret by the Vatican in the 1950s. The legend states that a team of priests and scientists, using esoteric principles, created a machine that could function as a kind of television for the past, allowing them to witness and record historical events like the crucifixion of Christ or speeches by Cicero in the Roman Senate. While the Vatican story remains an unsubstantiated legend, it provides a fascinating parallel. The idea of a time TV was already in the ether. At Montauk, they allegedly turned that idea into a functional piece of military hardware. They called it the Seeing Eye. It wasn't a completely new machine, but rather a different and more subtle application of the time tunnel technology they had already created. Instead of using the SAGE transmitter to pump an overwhelming amount of energy into a psychic link to tear a hole in reality, they learned to use a much lower, more finely tuned frequency. The process still began with a psychic operator in the Montauk chair. One of the Montauk boys would be given a set of temporal spatial coordinates. Washington, D.C., Ford's Theater, April 14, 1865, 10 p.m. The operator's mind would act as the targeting system, creating the initial faint resonance with that precise moment in space-time. Once the lock was achieved, the engineers would feed just enough power into the link to open a stable, one-way window. This portal was not large enough for matter to pass through, but it allowed light and sound to travel from the past into their laboratory in the present. You can imagine the scene. In a darkened room, a screen flickers to life, not with a grainy black and white image, but with a crystal clear, full color and full sound moving picture. It's a live feed from the past. The researchers at Montauk could now become the ultimate voyeurs, watching any event in human history unfold as if they were there. The applications of this technology, as described by the whistleblowers, were staggering. For military intelligence, it was the ultimate key. They could watch enemy troop movements in past wars to analyze long-forgotten strategies. They could listen in real time to the private conversations between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin at the Yalta Conference. They could pinpoint the exact location of a downed pilot in the Vietnam jungle by simply rewinding to the moment of the crash and watching where he went. The entire tactical history of the world was an open book to them. For historians and scientists, it was a tool of unimaginable power. Debates that had raged for centuries could be settled in an afternoon. They could witness the construction of Stonehenge, watch the eruption of Vesuvius over Pompeii, or listen to the real words spoken by historical figures, unfiltered by centuries of translation and interpretation. But with this power came a much darker potential. Imagine the ability to target any individual, a political rival, a corporate leader, a foreign diplomat, and review their entire life. You could find any moment of weakness, any youthful indiscretion, any secret conversation. It was the ultimate tool for blackmail and psychological warfare. No secret, anywhere in history, was safe. The most profound aspect of the Seeing Eye, according to the accounts, was its maneuverability. It wasn't a static window. The psychic operator, with guidance from the researchers, could move the point of observation. If they were watching a king in his throne room, they could shift the view to a different corner of the room, zoom in to read a letter on his desk, or even drift through a wall to see what was happening in the next chamber. It was like controlling a floating, invisible, silent drone camera that could go anywhere, at any time. This alleged power of perfect, total surveillance forces you to confront a deeply unsettling question about the nature of privacy itself. If a technology existed that could see and hear any moment in the past, what would that mean for the very concept of secrets? Could any private conversation, any classified meeting, any personal moment in history truly be considered secure ever again? The existence of the seeing eye would mean that every word ever spoken still hangs in the air, waiting for someone with the right technology to tune in and listen. They had achieved a form of technological omniscience, the ability to see and know all of history. But as they would soon discover, there is a vast and dangerous difference between watching the past and trying to change it. The power to watch history was godlike, but the power to rewrite it was a temptation of a higher and more dangerous order. Despite the inherent risks, the chilling logic of paradoxes that have fascinated physicists and philosophers for decades, you find that the Montauk project did not remain passive observers for long. They began to nudge the past, to correct what they saw as mistakes, to improve their present. They began to touch history, and you learn that history, when touched, has a tendency to shatter. Your investigation into their temporal meddling leads you straight to a concept that is a well-established cornerstone of theoretical physics: the grandfather paradox. It's a simple, elegant, and deeply troubling thought experiment. If you build a time machine and travel to the past to kill your own grandfather before he meets your grandmother, you would never have been born. But if you were never born, you couldn't have gone back in time to commit the act in the first place. It's a perfect, unbreakable loop of logic, a clear sign that the past should be immutable. The scientists at Montauk, armed with their unprecedented technology, allegedly decided to test that assumption. The first interventions, as the story goes, were minor. An operative would be sent back a few days with a simple instruction: move a specific book from a desk to a shelf in an empty room on the base. The operative would complete the mission and return. In the present, the book would now be on the shelf. The change was successful, but there would be subtle, unintended side effects. A coffee mug that was on the shelf might now be on the floor, broken. A guard might have a fuzzy memory of seeing the book in both places at once. The timeline, they found, was like a surface of water. Even the smallest pebble creates ripples, and those ripples are not always predictable. Emboldened, they attempted larger changes. They would try to prevent a documented, non-fatal accident involving a piece of equipment on the base from a week earlier. The operative would succeed, return to the present, and find that not only was the accident erased from the logs, but the timeline had changed in more significant ways. The technician who would have been involved in the accident was transferred to a different department, which caused a different project to be delayed, which meant a key researcher he was supposed to meet was now a stranger. The ripples were growing into waves. Every change they made created a cascade of unforeseen consequences, making their own present unstable and fluid. According to Preston Nichols, they discovered they could also weaponize temporal distortion on a small scale. Using the powerful focused energy of the delta T antenna, they could lock onto a person and create a time loop, forcing them to experience the same few seconds or minutes of their life over and over again. It was a form of psychological torture that left no marks, trapping a person in a tiny, repeating fragment of their own existence. Faced with the growing chaos of an unstable timeline, the researchers allegedly developed an astonishing and audacious solution. They created an artificial, localized reality. They used the base's powerful transmitters to generate a complex electromagnetic field around Camp Hero, creating what Nichols describes as a time bubble. Inside this bubble, which was centered on the base, time was fluid and malleable. They could launch an intervention into the past, and the resulting new timeline would manifest only within the bubble. This allowed them to study the changes, to see the consequences of their actions in a contained environment, before deciding whether to collapse the bubble and release the new timeline into the world, or attempt to reverse the change. It was during these experiments you learn that they stumbled upon the true nature of their meddling, a discovery that aligns with another legitimate, though highly debated scientific concept: the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. Proposed by physicist Hugh Everett, this theory suggests that every possible outcome of any given choice or event is real, The universe is constantly splitting into parallel, alternate versions of itself. The Montauk scientists, the story claims, found this to be terrifyingly true. They weren't actually rewriting their own past. Every time they made a significant change that they allowed to settle, they weren't altering their own timeline. They were causing it to branch off, to splinter into a new, parallel universe. They had created an alternate reality that now existed independently with its own history, its own future, and its own population of billions who would live their entire lives never knowing that their world was the result of a secret experiment on Long Island. This realization leads you to a profoundly unsettling existential question. If your reality is just one of an infinite number of possible timelines, what does that say about the significance of your own life and the choices you make? And how would you know if the past you remember is the one you were actually born into? The story suggests that we could all be living in a splintered timeline, our history subtly or drastically different from the original, with no way of ever knowing it. The Montauk Project had become a factory for creating universes, a role for which they were dangerously, catastrophically unprepared. The discovery that they were not just exploring time but actively creating new universes with every major intervention was a sobering, almost paralyzing realization. The power they wielded was far greater and more chaotic than they had ever imagined. But the fundamental technology of the vortex they found was not limited to just the fourth dimension. You learn that if the time tunnel was a bridge that could span the decades, the scientists soon began to wonder if it could also be a bridge across the vast, empty distances of space. Their new target was the most alluring and mysterious of our celestial neighbors, Mars. The red planet has always captured human imagination, a canvas for our hopes of finding extraterrestrial life and our dreams of interplanetary colonization. And in the 1970s, that imagination was supercharged by a single, grainy photograph. In 1976, NASA's Viking 1 orbiter, while imaging a potential landing site, captured an image of the Cydonia region. In that photo, a particular landform, a trick of light and shadow on a mile-long mesa, looked uncannily like a human face staring up into the void. This face on Mars, though later proven by higher resolution imagery to be a natural formation, became an instant icon for those who believed that Mars harbored ancient alien secrets. This is the well-established cultural backdrop against which the Montauk Project's most interstellar claims are set. The project's scientists, the story goes, began to theorize that the space-time coordinates used to target the past and future could be modified. What if they held the temporal coordinate constant, the present, and instead changed the three spatial coordinates? They needed a psychic lock, a clear target. So they allegedly put their best operators, perhaps Duncan Cameron or one of the more powerful Montauk boys, into the chair. They were shown the Viking photograph along with astronomical charts and every piece of geological data available on the Cydonia region. Their instruction: focus, go there. The familiar process unfolded. The psychic lock was achieved. The SAGE transmitter poured energy into the link, and the vortex tore open in the underground chamber. But this time the flickering images in the tunnel walls were not of Earth's history, and the air that gusted out of the portal was thin, cold, and tinged with the scent of red dust. They had opened a stable, physical gateway between a bunker in Long Island and the surface of Mars. According to the accounts of Al Bielek and others who expanded the story, the first probes and operatives sent through confirmed what fringe theorists had hoped for all along. They found ruins, vast, ancient, and non-human structures, buried beneath the Martian sand, dormant for millions of years. This discovery alone would have been the greatest secret in human history, but they allegedly found something else, something far more shocking and immediate. While exploring the vast underground caverns, they encountered other people. They found an active, thriving, and entirely human colony. This is where the story leaps into the concept of a breakaway civilization. The colonists on Mars were not from NASA. They were, the tale insists, part of a much older, more technologically advanced, and completely secret space program that had split off from mainstream society decades earlier. This secret group, using back-engineered alien technology or some other physics breakthrough, had achieved interplanetary travel long before the public Apollo program. The Montauk project hadn't discovered a new world. They had accidentally stumbled upon a parallel branch of humanity that was already living there. Suddenly, the Montauk vortex had a new, strategic purpose. It was no longer just a time machine. It was a jump gate. It was the ultimate logistical tool, a stargate between Earth and Mars. Why spend months traveling on a conventional rocket when you could step through a doorway and be there in an instant? Montauk, it is claimed, became the primary, clandestine transport hub, facilitating a secret alliance between the deep state on Earth and the breakaway colony on Mars, moving personnel, equipment, and resources between the two planets. And this new gateway provided a sinister solution to an old problem. What was to be done with the Montauk boys whose psychic abilities were fading, or who had become psychologically unstable from the repeated trauma? The Mars colony, you learn, was the answer. They were offered a choice, a new life, a fresh start, in an exciting off-world colony. For these lost and broken children, it may have sounded like a promise of salvation. In reality, it was a one-way ticket, a convenient, permanent, and utterly final way to dispose of the evidence of the project's terrestrial crimes. This claim, of a fully operational secret space program, forces you to ask a question about the nature of secrecy itself. If a secret project had technology that was 50 or 100 years ahead of the public sector, is it possible they could have achieved things like space colonization in total secrecy? How large could the gap between the classified world and the public world truly be? The project's scope had now expanded beyond the confines of Earth, beyond the timeline of known history. They were managing parallel universes and running an interplanetary transport service. But it all begged a much deeper question. Where did the knowledge for such impossible technologies originally come from? The ability to manipulate time, create splinter universes, and open gateways to other planets seems far beyond the scope of even the most secret 20th century science. It strains the limits of what human ingenuity, however well-funded, could plausibly achieve. This realization forces a fundamental question of origins. Where did the blueprint for this impossible technology come from? You find that the deepest, most fiercely guarded secret of the Montauk project was allegedly not what they did, but where they got the tools to do it. The story claims the technology was not human. To find the source, your investigation must trace the thread back decades before the Montauk base was even operational, to the arid desert of New Mexico and the single most famous event in the history of ufology. You arrive at Roswell, July 1947. This is, of course, a well-established and real historical event. On July 8th, the Public Information Office at Roswell Army Airfield issued a stunning press release, stating that they had recovered a flying disc from a nearby ranch. The story was on the front page of newspapers across the country, but within 24 hours, the military reversed its position. The disc was now just a common weather balloon. Decades later, the story would change again, to a top-secret Project Mogul balloon designed to monitor Soviet nuclear tests. These shifting explanations have, for many, only served to fuel the belief that something extraordinary was being covered up. According to the grand unified conspiracy that connects these events, the cover-up at Roswell was hiding the most significant discovery in human history. It was a crashed alien spacecraft, and the military recovered not just the exotic wreckage, but the ship's occupants. This event, the story goes, thrust the American shadow government into a new and terrifying reality. They were not alone in the universe, and they now possessed technology that was millennia ahead of their own. You then uncover an even darker and more elaborate layer to this story. The crash was not an isolated incident, but a catalyst for contact. A secret treaty was allegedly brokered between the United States government and a species of extraterrestrials, often identified in the lore as the small grays from the Zeta Reticuli star system. It was a technology exchange, a devil's bargain. The aliens were given permission to operate in our skies and to abduct a limited number of human citizens for their own genetic and scientific research, all without government interference. In return, the shadow government would receive the keys to the kingdom: advanced alien technology related to energy, propulsion, and, most critically, the manipulation of space-time. This is the alleged source of the Montauk technology. Preston Nichols and others claim that the Montauk chair was a direct, if crude, human attempt to back-engineer the control system from the recovered Roswell craft. The alien vessel, they assert, had no manual controls, no yoke, no throttle, no keyboard. It was operated entirely by the mind of its pilot. The pilot's chair was an integral part of the ship, a sophisticated biofeedback device that would read the pilot's telepathic commands, amplify them, and translate them directly into instructions for the ship's navigation and propulsion. When the pilot thought, "go left," the chair would interface with the ship and it would go left. When the pilot visualized a destination, the ship's drive system would create a localized space-time distortion to take it there. You can see the direct parallel. The Montauk chair is a reverse-engineered copy of this alien interface. The whole project, from its inception, was an attempt to understand and master this mind-to-machine connection. This new context reframes the entire timeline of the conspiracy. You see humanity's first clumsy attempt to play with these forces on its own, with the Philadelphia experiment in 1943, resulting in a horrific disaster. Then a few years later, in 1947, the aliens arrive, perhaps drawn by this crude rip in space-time. They see a species playing with nuclear fire and temporal mechanics and decide to intervene, offering their safer technology to guide and control humanity's development. The most extreme version of this claim is that the collaboration wasn't just theoretical. The whistleblowers allege that alien advisors were physically present in the deepest, most secure levels of the Montauk base. They were there to oversee the assembly and operation of the back-engineered technology, to ensure the human scientists didn't make another catastrophic mistake like the one in Philadelphia. The project wasn't just using alien hardware, it had alien technical support. This entire narrative forces you to consider a profound question about technological progress. Throughout history, massive paradigm-shifting leaps often seem to appear from nowhere. If humanity were to suddenly acquire technology that was thousands of years beyond our own scientific understanding, would we truly be its masters? Or would we become a kind of cargo cult, following a complex instruction manual for a machine whose true purpose and ultimate implications we could never possibly comprehend? With alien technology and alleged alien guidance, the Montauk project was now operating with the full power of the gods. But this power, untethered from human wisdom and morality, would lead directly to the project's most infamous and self-destructive climax. With access to alien technology, a secret colony on Mars, and the ability to navigate the currents of time, the Montauk project had reached a pinnacle of power that was utterly unprecedented and dangerously unstable. But you learn that a machine that can make any thought real has a terrifying and fatal vulnerability: the uncontrollable, irrational, and dark corners of the human subconscious. On a specific fateful date, that vulnerability would allegedly erupt, tearing the entire project apart in a storm of psychic chaos and physical destruction. The date was August 12th, 1983. You find that this date is not random. It is a deeply significant anniversary within the conspiracy's internal logic. August 12th, 1983 was exactly 40 years, to the day, after the alleged date of the Philadelphia experiment. According to the whistleblowers, the project's directors had become obsessed with this 40-year biorhythm of the Earth and planned their ultimate experiment for this date. The goal was to create a massive, fully stable wormhole linking the USS Eldridge in 1943 directly to the Montauk base in 1983, a grand unification of their research. It was to be their magnum opus. It would become their tombstone. Imagine you are in the control room on that night. The air is thick with ozone and tension. Every senior scientist and military commander is present, their faces illuminated by the green glow of computer monitors. The power being drawn by the SAGE transmitter is immense, causing the lights throughout the entire underground facility to flicker and dim. At the heart of it all is Duncan Cameron, strapped into the Montauk chair, his body rigid, his mind the conduit for the unthinkable energies being unleashed. The link to 1943 is open, but the connection is violent and unstable. Alarms begin to chime as the energy fields fluctuate beyond all safe parameters. The project is on the verge of a catastrophic meltdown. It is at this moment of peak crisis that the story takes its final, horrific turn. The project directors are losing control of the experiment, and more importantly, they are losing control of Duncan. Some accounts claim that a deep, subconscious trigger, a secret contingency plan programmed into Duncan by a rival faction, was designed to activate at this very moment. Others say he simply broke under the strain, his conscious mind overwhelmed by the temporal storm, leaving his most primal instincts in control of the most powerful thought projector ever built. A command is given, or perhaps it arises from Duncan himself. Let it go. Manifest what's in your subconscious. Now. Duncan doesn't consciously choose what to create. He simply releases 40 years of his own trauma, the rage of a stolen life, the fear of the experiments, a raw, formless, primal scream from the deepest, most animalistic part of his psyche. From his Freudian id, the Montauk chair receives this blast of pure, violent instinct. The Cray 1 computer struggles to translate the untranslatable. The transmitter amplifies it into a signal of pure chaos. And somewhere on the surface of Camp Hero, this psychic tumor is given physical form. The security monitors in the control room flicker, showing a scene of pure pandemonium. It has materialized. A creature. A monster. The descriptions from the supposed witnesses are all eerily similar. A story that strongly echoes the plot of the classic 1956 sci-fi film, Forbidden Planet. They speak of a massive, hulking beast, somewhere between 8 and 10 feet tall, covered in dark, matted hair. It is a roaring, mindless thing, an engine of pure destruction, the physical embodiment of Duncan Cameron's id. The beast goes on a rampage. It smashes through buildings, tears heavy equipment from its moorings, and swats away security personnel like flies. The frantic calls on the radio report that bullets are having no effect. They pass right through it, or seem to strike it without causing any injury. The scientists in the control room realize the terrifying truth. The monster is not a biological creature. It is a psychic projection, a thought made solid. As long as Duncan Cameron is in the chair, his subconscious feeding the image and the transmitter powering its existence, the creature is effectively immortal. It cannot be killed, because in a sense, it isn't truly alive. It is a phantom with substance. This brings you face to face with the story's most chilling question, one that turns from speculative science to deep psychology. What dark things lurk in the unexamined corners of our own minds? If you were given the power to make any thought real, could you be certain that only your conscious, rational mind would be in control? Or might your own secret fears and suppressed rages claw their way into the light? For the staff at Montauk, this was no longer a philosophical question. It was a 10-foot-tall monster, and it was heading for the transmitter building. The base commander, watching the carnage unfold, knows there is only one way to stop it. They can't kill the projection. They have to kill the projector. Faced with an unkillable monster of pure thought chewing its way through his base and threatening to unleash untold chaos, the commander at Montauk made the only choice he had left. The experiment had to be terminated. The project, with all its godlike power and horrifying secrets, had to be burned to the ground effective immediately. What followed on that chaotic night of August 12, 1983, was not a calm, orderly shutdown, but a frantic, violent, and desperate demolition designed to erase a nightmare from the face of the earth. You hear the accounts of the chaos, pieced together from the recovered memories of the few who claim the mind wipe didn't fully take. In the control room, alarms are screaming. On the monitors, the beast from the id is closing in on the main transmitter building. The order is given: cut the power. Preston Nichols, at his engineering console, frantically tries to execute shutdown commands, but the system, locked in a temporal paradox and flooded with raw psychic energy from Duncan Cameron, is unresponsive. The software solution has failed. It would require a physical one. The narrative splits here into a sequence of pure desperation. According to one version of the story, Nichols himself knew there was a manual override. He and the base commander raced from the control room to a junction box deep in the bowels of the base. In another telling, 2 other technicians were dispatched with fire axes to the main power conduits that fed the subterranean levels. You can picture the scene. In a concrete bunker humming with unimaginable power, Two men swing axes against cables as thick as a man's arm. With each strike, a shower of brilliant blue and white sparks erupts. The air fills with the smell of burning insulation. With a final desperate chop, the cables are severed. The effect is instantaneous. The deep, resonant hum that was the constant heartbeat of the base for over a decade dies. The main lights go out, replaced by the dim red glow of emergency backup power. The computer screens in the control room go black, and on the surface, the monster, its psychic lifeline to Duncan Cameron's mind now cut, lets out a final silent roar. Its form flickers, becomes transparent, and in a split second, it evaporates into the night air as if it had never been. The immediate crisis is over, but the true work is just beginning. The project has been compromised. An unthinkable event has occurred, and now the evidence must be buried so deep that no one can ever dig it up. A prearranged contingency plan, designed for just such a catastrophic failure, is activated. Within hours, you learn, a special forces unit arrives at the base. This is the cleanup crew, a team whose specialty is making things disappear. Their work is brutal and efficient. They are not preservationists, they are demolishers. They storm the underground labs with sledgehammers and crowbars, smashing every piece of delicate, irreplaceable equipment. The Montauk chair is torn apart. The Cray 1 supercomputer is dismantled. Reels of magnetic tape containing priceless data are thrown into industrial incinerators. Every document, every notebook, every schematic is burned to ash. Then, according to the legend, the cement trucks arrive. They back up to the hidden entrances and elevator shafts and begin to pump thousands of tons of concrete down into the earth, filling the deepest levels, entombing the Delta T antenna and whatever other secrets lay in the project's darkest chambers. Here, the official history of the base provides a convenient window. Montauk Air Force Station was officially decommissioned in 1981, but the land wasn't turned over to New York State until 1984. This intervening period is a gray area, a time of government caretaker status. The Montauk story claims this is when the real cleanup happened, under the guise of routine environmental abatement and closure procedures. Finally, the crew turns to the most difficult evidence to erase: the human personnel. Every living witness, from the senior scientists down to the janitorial staff, must be silenced. They are rounded up and subjected to the project's own mind control technologies. Their memories of the project, the chair, the time travel, the monster, are systematically erased. They are implanted with new, mundane memories of having served a boring, uneventful tour of duty at a simple radar installation. They are then debriefed, discharged, and reassimilated into society, becoming walking cover stories, their own minds the final layer of the cover-up. This leads you to a deeply unsettling philosophical question. If you could truly erase a secret not just from documents and hard drives, but from the minds of the people who lived it, would that secret ever have truly existed at all? What is the difference between an event that never happened and an event that no one can remember? The cleanup crew's final act was to turn the Montauk project into a ghost, a rumor, a hole in history itself. The equipment was smashed, the labs were filled, the minds were wiped. As far as the official world was concerned, the project was now, and had always been, nothing more than a fantasy. The official story is that a secret project was erased. The equipment was destroyed, the memories were wiped, the concrete was poured, the book was closed. But can a secret of that magnitude ever be truly buried? Can a scar on reality be so perfectly healed that no trace remains? To find out, you have to return to where it all began. You leave the realm of recovered memories and fantastical stories, and you go back to the cold, hard, physical reality of Camp Hero State Park as it exists today. You walk the same trails you did when you first arrived, but now your perspective is entirely different. Where you once saw a peaceful, if slightly eerie nature preserve, you now see a sprawling, silent crime scene. This is the well-established, verifiable reality of the place. It is a public park, peppered with the skeletal remains of a decommissioned Air Force station. Tourists are here, walking their dogs, taking scenic photos of the iconic radar tower against the Atlantic sky. Nature is patiently doing its work, covering concrete with moss and splitting asphalt with resilient weeds. On the surface, it is a place where history is quietly decaying. But you are looking deeper. Your eyes are drawn not to the picturesque lighthouse, but to the details that don't fit the peaceful narrative. You focus on the sealed entrances you noticed before, but now you see them with the story of the frantic 1983 shutdown in your mind. These aren't just gates with padlocks. You find a doorway leading into the side of a hill that has been completely filled with a solid block of concrete. You find a steel blast door, feet thick, welded shut at every seam. You find a ventilation shaft that has been capped with a massive, immovable concrete plug. The official explanation provided by the Park Service is simple and sensible: public safety. These are old, unstable military tunnels, full of lead paint and asbestos, and they are sealed to prevent curious teenagers from getting lost or hurt. It is a perfectly logical explanation, yet the sheer brutal finality of the seals feels like something more. It feels less like a safety precaution and more like an act of entombment. You can't help but picture the cement trucks from the story, hastily pouring their contents down into the earth to bury the sins of the project forever. You dig into the online communities of urban explorers, the people who have dedicated years to probing the weaknesses in Camp Hero's perimeter. You find grainy photos and hushed late-night videos from those who have managed to slip into the few buildings that aren't completely sealed. They don't find a time tunnel or an alien advisor. They find something more subtle, but just as strange. They find rooms that are empty, but with floors covered in the bolt holes where immense heavy machinery was once anchored. They find conduits running through the walls designed to carry cables of an extraordinary thickness, hinting at power requirements far beyond what a simple SAGE radar would need. They find rooms that are inexplicably shielded with copper and lead, as if to contain powerful radiation or electromagnetic fields. You find legends among these explorers about specific locations on the base. There is talk of a field, now overgrown, that was used as a massive burn pit in the mid-80s, where witnesses at the time saw smoke rising for days. Some investigators claim to have taken sensitive magnetometers to these hotspots and registered bizarre, localized magnetic anomalies, as if the ground itself still holds a charge from the exotic technology that was destroyed there. And the whispers you heard from the old-timers in town, the stories of strange animal behavior and oppressive feelings in the air from the 1970s, you find that they haven't entirely gone away. You read modern accounts from hikers and paranormal investigators who visit the park. They report the same phenomena: patches of forest where the birds fall unnervingly silent, sudden, inexplicable feelings of dread or paranoia that vanish as soon as they leave a certain area. Even the legend of the hum persists, with some visitors claiming to feel a low-frequency vibration in their teeth when standing near the base of the old radar tower. As you stand there looking at a concrete-filled doorway, you are faced with a crucial question about the nature of proof. When you look at a ruin, do you see only what is there, decay, rust, and concrete? Or do you see the ghost of what might have been? How much of the evidence for a conspiracy is found not in the artifacts themselves, but in the story we choose to build around them? The physical remains of Montauk Air Force Station are maddeningly ambiguous. They are a Rorschach test painted on a canvas of concrete and steel. To a skeptic, it is nothing more than a fascinating but ordinary Cold War relic. To a believer, every sealed door, every oversized cable duct, every strange feeling is another piece of a horrifying puzzle. The ruins alone cannot prove the story. You need something more. You need a smoking gun. Awaiting, continue. The ruins of Camp Hero whisper a story of secrets and decay, but they don't shout a confession. For the case of the Montauk Project to be more than just a compelling narrative, more than a feeling or a collection of strange anecdotes, you need something tangible. You need hard evidence. And for years, the primary whistleblower, Preston Nichols, claimed to have just that. He didn't just come forward with recovered memories. He came forward, he said, with the last surviving artifacts, documents, and technological remnants of the entire project. You dive into the archives of his work, the books, the videotaped lectures, the old internet forums where he would answer questions. You are looking for the smoking gun. One of the most famous pieces of evidence he presented was a physical Montauk chair. In photographs and videos, you see Nichols displaying what looks like a modified dental or barber's chair. It's wrapped in heavy-gauge copper coils, with a strange helmet-like antenna assembly positioned above the headrest, all of it connected by a thick bundle of wires to a rack of mysterious electronic equipment. He claimed this was either a salvaged component from the project or a working replica he built from the original, now classified schematics that he recalled through his recovered memories. To a visitor, it was a bizarre sculpture of scrap electronics. To Nichols, it was a machine that could read and project the human soul. He would also produce smaller, more specific artifacts during his presentations. He'd hold up a strange, oversized vacuum tube, claiming it was a special psychotronic tube capable of handling the unique frequencies of consciousness. He'd display custom-built helical coils and waveguides that he insisted were salvaged parts of the subterranean Delta T antenna, the very device that opened the time vortex. To the layperson, it's just a collection of weird junk. But to Nichols, and to his followers, these were the holy relics of a secret scientific war. However, as you investigate the context of these artifacts, you run into a powerful and mundane explanation for their existence. This brings you to a well-established fact: the vast and fascinating world of military surplus. After the end of the Cold War, the US government, needing to clear out decades of accumulated hardware, auctioned off mountains of decommissioned electronic equipment. Warehouses full of components from radar stations, communications hubs, and experimental labs were sold by the pound to hobbyists, engineers, and scrap dealers. A skilled electrical engineer like Preston Nichols, with deep knowledge of RF technology, would have had easy access to all manner of strange, esoteric, and visually impressive military-grade hardware. He could have legally bought every single component he ever displayed. The evidence he presented was not limited to hardware. Nichols also claimed to have found proof hidden in the project's paper trail. He never produced a document stamped "Top Secret Montauk Project." Instead, he pointed to a pattern of anomalies in the official unclassified records. He would show requisition forms for Camp Hero that included orders for an unusually large number of specific electronic parts. He would point to the base's utility records, arguing that the power consumption was far too high for a simple radar installation, suggesting a massive, energy-hungry facility operating underground. For Nichols, these weren't clerical errors. They were the ghostly footprints of a black project, hiding in the noise of official bureaucracy. Perhaps the most compelling demonstrations were the devices he claimed to have built based on Montauk principles. He spoke of developing psychoacoustic technology, machines that could use specific sound frequencies to influence human emotions. In one famous story, he claimed to have taken a portable device to a park where a group of people were becoming rowdy and aggressive. He turned on his machine, which emitted a barely audible sound, and within minutes, the crowd's mood shifted. The anger dissipated and they became calm and peaceful, and these demonstrations, he argued, were proof that the fundamental science behind Montauk's mood control technology was real. Yet, as you examine this tangled web of evidence, a consistent problem emerges. Every single piece of proof, from the chair to the documents to the mood machine, relies entirely on Preston Nichols' testimony to give it extraordinary meaning. The chair is just a chair with wires until he tells you its story. The strange vacuum tube is just an old piece of surplus until he assigns it a fantastical purpose. The evidence never speaks for itself, and this forces you to confront a critical question about the burden of proof. When someone presents a piece of unusual-looking hardware and claims it's part of a secret time machine, what level of proof is required? Is the object itself evidence, or does it only become evidence when its origin and function can be independently and scientifically verified? The artifacts are tantalizing. They are strange. They fit the narrative perfectly, but they lack provenance. Nichols' tangible evidence remains just as ambiguous as the concrete-sealed tunnels of Camp Hero. It proves he was a clever engineer who was passionate about his story, but it doesn't prove that the story itself is true. The smoking gun remains elusive, lost in a haze of military surplus and personal testimony. The hardware is ambiguous. The documents are inconclusive. The physical evidence for the Montauk project seems to dissolve into plausible deniability the closer you look. But the most terrible of all the claims, the one that elevates the story from a sci-fi fantasy to a genuine horror, was not about technology but about people. The story of the Montauk boys. If this claim that hundreds of runaway children were abducted and used as expendable psychic fuel is true, it should have left a different kind of trace. Not a scar on the landscape, but a hole in the population. a statistical ghost haunting the public records. You begin a grim and difficult search. If a secret program was systematically removing children from the streets of New York and Long Island for over a decade, from the early 1970s to 1983, surely there would be a paper trail. You start looking for evidence of a spike in missing persons reports, a cluster of unsolved disappearances. Anything in the official data that would suggest a serial predator of unimaginable scale was at work. Almost immediately, you encounter a heartbreaking and frustrating historical reality. This brings you to a well-established fact about law enforcement and social services in that era. Before the mid-1980s, there was no robust national system for tracking missing children in the United States. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children wasn't founded until 1984. Before that, the process was tragically inefficient and localized. A child who went missing in one precinct might be a complete unknown to the one next door. And most critically for this investigation, there was often a stark difference in how the disappearances of different children were treated. A child from a suburban home would get a full investigation. A runaway, a homeless youth with no one to file a report, was often just another statistic, assumed to have moved on to the next city, their absence barely noted. This is the central challenge for any researcher trying to verify the Montauk boys' claim. You are looking for ghosts in a system that was not designed to see them in the first place. Despite this, you find the work of independent investigators who have tried. They have spent countless hours in the archives of local libraries, scrolling through microfiche of old newspapers looking for patterns. They have filed Freedom of Information Act requests for decades-old police files from Suffolk County. They are searching for a signal in the noise. What they've found is deeply inconclusive. There are plenty of tragic stories of missing children from that era, but there is no definitive cluster, no undeniable statistical spike that points a finger directly at Montauk. And this is where the theory itself presents a chilling defense. The architects of the Montauk Project, the story goes, were brilliant and meticulous. They knew that taking children who would be missed would create a pattern and an investigation, so they deliberately targeted the invisible. They abducted the children who had already fallen through the cracks of society, the ones with no parents or guardians to sound the alarm. They chose the perfect victims, whose disappearance would create no official record because they were already off the record. The crime was designed from its inception to be undocumented. Without a paper trail, you are left with anecdotes and testimony. You find third-hand stories from retired social workers who remember an unusual number of kids vanishing from the New York Port Authority bus terminal in the late 70s. You read accounts of former police officers who recall rumors of strange, unmarked government vehicles seen approaching homeless youths. This is not evidence, but folklore that echoes the central claims. Then you encounter the most direct and yet most problematic form of human evidence, the alleged survivors. Over the decades since Nichols and Bielik first told their stories, a small number of other individuals have come forward, claiming to be the adult survivors of the Montauk Boys program. They tell fragmented, nightmarish stories of their own recovered memories, of being in the chair, of seeing the time tunnel, of brutal conditioning in the underground labs. Their accounts are often emotionally powerful, but they are also impossible to verify, filled with the dreamlike logic of trauma, and often emerging only after years of hypnotic regression therapy. This presents a profound dilemma. Do you accept the testimony of these individuals as corroboration? Or is it possible that these are deeply troubled people who, searching for an explanation for their own trauma, have latched onto the powerful Montauk mythos and integrated it into their own personal narratives? And so you must confront the central, haunting question of this entire line of inquiry. How do you find evidence for a crime whose victims were deliberately chosen because they lived in the margins of society? If a child was never officially missing because no one was there to report it, does their absence leave any trace in history at all? The search for the Montauk Boys ends in a place of deep, tragic uncertainty. There are no conclusive records, no authenticated survivors, no definitive list of the lost. There is only the horrifying allegation and the chilling reality that if such a program did exist, its architects may have succeeded in committing a truly invisible atrocity, a crime whose victims can never be counted because they were never counted to begin with. The search for the Montauk Boys leaves us with nothing but stories, powerful, tragic, but ultimately unverified. The physical evidence from the base and its alleged technicians is circumstantial at best, and this forces us to turn our investigation away from the alleged events and toward the very nature of the testimony itself. The entire sprawling, decade-spanning epic of the Montauk Project, from the Philadelphia experiment to the beast from the id, is built on a single, precarious foundation: the recovered memories of a handful of men. And to truly investigate this story, you have to investigate the reliability of memory itself. You delve into the controversial world of psychology and the fierce debates that raged in the 1990s, a period often called the Memory Wars. This was a real and intense scientific and cultural conflict. On one side were therapists and patients who passionately defended the concept of repressed memories, the idea that the mind can bury severe trauma so deeply that it becomes inaccessible for years, only to be recovered later in therapy. On the other side were cognitive psychologists and researchers who demonstrated, through clinical studies, a deeply unsettling phenomenon: the creation of detailed, emotionally resonant, and entirely false memories. This research gave birth to the concept of false memory syndrome, a condition in which a person's identity and relationships are affected by memories of traumatic experiences which are objectively false, but which they believe to be true. To be clear, this isn't about calling someone a liar. Lying is a conscious act of deception. The creation of a false memory, a process called confabulation, is an unconscious and sincere act. The brain abhors a vacuum. When faced with gaps in memory, confusion, or trauma, it can spontaneously generate details, narratives, and entire life events to create a coherent story that makes sense of the available information. And once that story is created, the brain remembers it as if it truly happened. The emotional weight of a false memory can be just as powerful as that of a real one. Now you turn this psychological lens onto the key figures of the Montauk narrative. You start with Preston Nichols. Recall his origin story. He was a man in personal turmoil, experiencing blackouts and a sense of living a double life. He was already investigating strange, real electronic phenomena emanating from a genuinely mysterious location. Then he visits a psychic who gives him a direct and powerful suggestion: you worked at Montauk. From the perspective of false memory theory, this is a potential catalyst of immense power. It provides a single, epic explanation for all of his problems. His memory gaps aren't a personal issue, they're the result of a government mind wipe. The strange signals aren't just a technical mystery, they're the echoes of a secret he was part of. His mind, primed with suggestion, could have then begun the process of confabulation, weaving together local legends, technical knowledge, and personal anxieties into the grand narrative of the Montauk Project. Then you look at Al Bielek, whose memories were famously triggered by watching the 1984 fictional movie, The Philadelphia Experiment. He also relied heavily on hypnotic regression to recover the details of his life, as Edward Cameron. Today, hypnosis is widely discredited as a reliable tool for memory retrieval. A person in a hypnotic state is in a state of heightened suggestibility. The therapist, however well-intentioned, can accidentally lead the witness. A simple question like, "Were you on a ship?" can plant a seed that blossoms under hypnosis into a rich, detailed, and utterly false memory of life aboard the USS Eldridge. You also encounter the phenomenon of source amnesia. This is when a person remembers a piece of information but forgets its source, eventually incorporating it as a personal experience. Think of the climactic story of the beast from the id. It's a terrifying and memorable event. It is also, as many researchers have pointed out, nearly identical to the central plot device of the popular 1956 science fiction film Forbidden Planet, where a scientist's subconscious manifests as an invisible, unstoppable monster. Is it possible that the creators of the Montauk story, having seen this film years earlier, unconsciously absorbed this powerful concept and, through confabulation, integrated it into their own narrative, sincerely believing it was a real memory? Viewed through this lens, the Montauk Project transforms. It is no longer a conspiracy of physics and hardware, but one of psychology and belief. It becomes a shared narrative, a modern myth constructed by a small group of people to explain the unexplainable aspects of their lives and the world around them. And it leads you to the most fundamental question about our own minds. How can you tell the difference between a memory of something that actually happened and a vivid, detailed story your own mind has constructed to make sense of the world? If a memory feels completely real, does that make it true? This psychological framework offers a powerful, rational, and entirely human explanation for the entire saga, suggesting the horror wasn't buried in a bunker beneath Long Island, but was born in the complex, mysterious, and ultimately fallible depths of human memory. The psychological explanation is a powerful one, suggesting the entire Montauk saga might be a myth born from trauma, suggestion, and the mind's own impressive ability to build a world. But to complete this declassification, you have to pair that theory with the official denials and the firm, unyielding laws of physics. You must now turn your attention to the case for the prosecution, the sober and systematic dismantling of the story from the skeptic's viewpoint. Your first stop is the official record. You seek out the government's response to the foundational legend that started it all, the Philadelphia experiment. You find that the U.S. Navy, and specifically its Office of Naval Research, ONR, has not been silent on the matter. This is a well-established fact. For decades, they have maintained a public and unequivocal stance, which you can find on their own website. They state in no uncertain terms that the Philadelphia experiment is a hoax. They explain that the story originated from the annotated ramblings of a man named Carl Allen in the 1950s and has since grown into a work of popular fiction. Most damningly, the ONR provides the actual, documented history of the USS Eldridge. The official ship's logs, the legally binding day-by-day record of a naval vessel's location and activities, show that the ship was not in Philadelphia during the alleged time of the experiment in the fall of 1943. In fact, its logs place it in New York and on sea trials in the Bahamas during that period. The historical record shows it was never even docked in Philadelphia at all. With this single verifiable fact, the entire origin story of the Montauk Project, which is explicitly framed as a continuation of the Philadelphia experiment, collapses. With the historical foundation removed, you turn to the scientific claims. You consult the principles of modern physics. The idea of creating a stable time tunnel or vortex is a staple of science fiction, but it has no basis in scientific reality. While theoretical physicists discuss the mathematics of wormholes, they also agree that creating one would require conditions that are, for all practical purposes, impossible. You would need to generate and control exotic matter with negative gravitational mass. You would need to wield energy densities comparable to the heart of a star. The SAGE radar at Montauk, while powerful for its time, generated millions of watts of power. A stable wormhole would require the energy equivalent of billions of stars. The power difference is not one of degree, but of physical possibility. It's the difference between lighting a match and creating a supernova. Furthermore, travel into the past, as described in the story, violates one of the most fundamental principles of the universe: causality. The law that cause must always precede effect. The grandfather paradox isn't just a fun riddle, it's a representation of a deep logical and physical inconsistency that makes backward time travel a near certain impossibility. Then there is the central technology of the Montauk chair. Neuroscience can tell us a great deal about the brain. We can read the electrical chaos of brain waves with an EEG, and we can see blood flow with an fMRI. But we cannot isolate a single coherent thought. A thought is not a discrete radio signal. It is a complex, emergent pattern of billions of neurons firing all across the brain. The idea that a chair with a few coils could pick out a specific mental image, translate it into a digital code, and broadcast it with enough fidelity to manifest it physically is, according to all known science, pure fantasy. Beyond the scientific impossibilities, you are faced with the logistical ones. A project of this scale, operating for over a decade and involving, according to some versions, thousands of scientists, technicians, military guards, and abducted children, would be impossible to keep secret. The Manhattan Project, which developed the atomic bomb, was one of the best-kept secrets of the 20th century. Yet today we have mountains of declassified documents, entire archives, and the testimonies of thousands of people who worked on it. By contrast, the only people who have ever claimed to be part of the Montauk Project are the small, interconnected group of original whistleblowers. There are no deathbed confessions from scientists, no leaked blueprints, no corroborating accounts from the hundreds of guards who would have been needed to secure such a facility. Finally, you return to the physical site of Camp Hero. For every strange feature, there is a simple, mundane explanation. The massive radar tower and its huge power consumption were for the SAGE system, a real, documented, and very power-hungry technology. The concrete bunkers are documented World War II coastal defense fortifications, and the sealed tunnels are sealed for the most boring reason of all, to keep people out of dangerous, decaying structures. There is nothing at Camp Hero that requires a paranormal or conspiratorial explanation. And so you are left with a question that invokes the principle of Occam's razor, the idea that the simplest solution is almost always the best one, which requires a greater leap of faith. To believe in a vast, multi-decade conspiracy involving alien technology, time travel, paradoxes, and thousands of mind-wiped participants, for which there is not a single piece of verifiable, unambiguous evidence. Or to believe that a few imaginative individuals, inspired by a mysterious old military base and their own personal experiences, crafted a compelling and elaborate work of modern folklore. From the skeptic's viewpoint, the case is closed. The Montauk Project is not a hidden chapter of history. It is a fascinating chapter in the history of storytelling. The skeptic's case is neat, logical, and powerful. It provides rational, evidence-based explanations that seem to close the book on the Montauk Project for good, consigning it to the realm of modern folklore. But in the Hall of Mirrors world of intelligence and disinformation, a story that is too perfectly absurd, a legend whose foundations are so easily disproven, can sometimes be a clue in itself. This leads you down one final, labyrinthine rabbit hole, a counter-conspiracy that is in many ways more unsettling than the original. What if the Montauk Project story is a lie, but it's a lie with a purpose? What if it's a psyop within a psyop? To even consider this, you have to accept a well-established, if uncomfortable, fact about the history of intelligence agencies. You look into the CIA's Family Jewels, a collection of internal reports declassified in 2007. They document decades of the agency's own illegal and covert activities. Among them are references to programs like Operation Mockingbird, an alleged large-scale campaign to manipulate the media by recruiting journalists to act as assets, planting stories, and generating propaganda. The historical record shows that the U.S. government has, in the past, demonstrated both the capability and the willingness to create and disseminate complex, false narratives to serve its own secret ends. With this precedent in mind, you can examine the Montauk story in a new light. The first version of this counter-theory is known as the lightning rod or poison pill hypothesis. It assumes that something secret and highly sensitive was happening at Camp Hero. It wasn't time travel or monsters, but it was something the government needed to protect. Perhaps it was cutting-edge research into stealth radar, making aircraft invisible to detection, a plausible continuation of the base's original mission. Or maybe it was a real, if more modest, psychotronics program, an East Coast cousin to the Stargate project, focused on electronic mind control. The problem in this scenario was that the project was getting noticed. The powerful emissions were causing the electronic interference the locals complained about. Strange antennas were being spotted. Rumors were starting to spread. The secret was leaking. So, how do you protect it? A simple denial might not be enough. Instead, you create a second, much wilder story. You invent a narrative so filled with impossible elements: the Philadelphia experiment, aliens, age regression, a beast from the id, that it attracts all the attention. This fantastical tale acts as a lightning rod. Anyone who gets too close to the real, sensitive research and tries to blow the whistle will be immediately and automatically discredited, dismissed as just another crazy person obsessed with the Montauk time travel myth. The absurdity of the lie becomes the perfect shield for the truth. A second, more mundane version of this theory suggests the secret being hidden wasn't high-tech at all, but simply criminal. What if the isolated, secure base was being used as an illegal dumping ground for hazardous chemical or radioactive waste from other government facilities on Long Island? A multi-million-dollar cleanup would be a bureaucratic nightmare. A wild story about psychic children and portals to Mars is a much more effective and cheaper way to distract and misdirect any serious investigation. But the final and most dizzying version of the theory is that the story itself was the experiment. Imagine the goal was not to hide something but to study something, the creation and propagation of a modern myth. The intelligence community, wanting to understand how belief systems form and spread outside the mainstream, decided to conduct a field test. They carefully crafted the Montauk narrative, weaving in just enough verifiable detail and just enough sci-fi fantasy to make it compelling. Then they needed to release it into the wild. They seeded the story by targeting specific, receptive individuals. Perhaps Preston Nichols wasn't a whistleblower, but the first unwitting subject. His mind subtly fed the core concepts of the narrative, which his own expertise and personal struggles then fleshed out. The entire Montauk conspiracy theory becomes a social experiment to test the viral spread of disinformation. This meta-conspiracy creates a truly unfalsifiable loop. Any evidence you find against the Montauk story can be reinterpreted as evidence for the disinformation campaign. The fact that the USS Eldridge was never in Philadelphia. That's what they want you to find, to make the story seem easily debunked. The lack of corroborating witnesses. Of course, the real project was much smaller. The absurdity of the claims becomes the ultimate proof that it's a cover story. It forces you to ask a profoundly difficult question for our modern age. When you're faced with a story that may be designed to be unbelievable, how do you find the truth? If a lie is big enough and strange enough, can it become a more effective shield for a secret than a simple denial ever could? You are left in a state of ultimate uncertainty. The story as told could be true. It could be a simple hoax born from memory and imagination. Or it could be one of the most brilliant and successful pieces of psychological warfare ever designed. A mystery where the storytellers themselves may not even know they are part of the script. And so, after a journey through fractured time, parallel dimensions, secret Martian colonies, and the deepest, darkest corridors of the human mind, you find yourself back where you started. You are standing on a windy bluff on the eastern tip of Long Island, in the salt-stung air of Camp Hero State Park, staring at a silent, monolithic radar tower. The journey is over, and you are left with the silence, the crumbling concrete, and a story so vast and contradictory that it defies easy conclusion. You are left with a choice between competing realities, each demanding its own kind of faith. On the one hand, you have the grand, terrible narrative of the Montauk Project. It's a cohesive, internally consistent saga that begins with a disastrous naval experiment in 1943 and ends with a monster born from a man's subconscious in 1983. It's a story populated by whistleblower engineers and time-traveling brothers, of alien benefactors and a shadow government playing with forces beyond its comprehension. It accounts for every strange rumor from the local town. It gives a dark purpose to the imposing SAGE radar and a sinister meaning to the sealed underground doors. It posits a secret history of the 20th century, a history of mind control, temporal warfare, and a human cost measured in the lives of lost children, all of which was successfully and almost perfectly erased. To believe this story is to accept that the world you know is a fraction of the real one, that the laws of physics are merely suggestions, and that a secret of unimaginable scope was kept by thousands of people for decades. It requires you to set aside the lack of physical proof and trust entirely in the recovered memories of a few key individuals. On the other hand, you have the case for the mundane. This is the sober reality presented by official records, mainstream science, and psychology. It's a story that is far less exciting, but far more grounded. In this version, the Philadelphia experiment was a hoax and the ship's logs prove it. Time travel to the past is a physical impossibility. The strange technology is all misidentified military surplus. The ruins of the base are just that, ruins, sealed for safety, not secrecy. The entire epic narrative is the product of a few creative and possibly troubled individuals. Their story's a textbook case of confabulation, suggestion, and the construction of false memories to make sense of a confusing world. The Montauk Project wasn't a secret government program. It was a modern myth, a campfire story for the conspiracy age. To believe this story is to accept that the strange electronic interference, the odd feelings in the air, and the local legends are all just coincidence and folklore. It requires you to dismiss the passionate, detailed, and consistent testimony of the whistleblowers as a shared delusion. It is the simple, rational explanation, the one that requires the fewest new assumptions. And finally, you are left with the Hall of Mirrors possibility, the theory of a psyop. In this version, the story is a lie, but it's a lie that was deliberately crafted by the very agencies it claims to expose. A brilliantly constructed piece of disinformation designed to discredit legitimate inquiry or to act as a shield for a different, more terrestrial secret. In this scenario, the absurdity of the story is its greatest strength, and the whistleblowers themselves are not authors, but pawns. To believe this story is to accept that you can trust no one and nothing, and that the truth may be buried under so many layers of deception that it is, for all practical purposes, completely lost. The truth of what happened here, if anything happened at all, remains stubbornly in the shadows. The only undeniable fact is the place itself. Camp Hero endures. The lighthouse still flashes its warning out to sea, and the great concrete tower still stands, a monument from a bygone era. The legacy of Montauk is this ambiguity. The story has taken on a life of its own, a powerful piece of modern folklore that speaks to our deepest anxieties about government overreach, the dangers of unchecked technology, and the terrifying possibility that our own minds and memories are not as reliable as we think. You look one last time at the tower, a silent giant against the setting sun, and you are left with the final overarching question of this entire investigation. What is the true nature of the shadow cast by that old radar tower? Is it the shadow of a real, buried history of technological horror, a secret so profound it changed the world in ways we can never know? Or is it the shadow of our own collective fears, a story we tell ourselves? Because the idea of a secret plan is sometimes less frightening than the idea that there is no plan at all. We've journeyed to the edge of reality and back, exploring the chilling possibility of a secret base where time was bent and minds were broken. We've weighed the incredible testimonies of whistleblowers against the steadfast denials of the government and the sober analysis of science. The story of the Montauk Project could be a hidden truth of horrific human experimentation, a complex psychological delusion born from trauma, or a masterful piece of disinformation designed to conceal a different secret entirely. The evidence is contradictory, the witnesses are compromised, and the physical location itself offers more questions than answers. In the end, the truth remains buried, perhaps under tons of concrete, or perhaps only in the complex pathways of the human mind. The ultimate conclusion is left to you, our fellow investigators. What do you believe happened in the shadow of the Montauk Lighthouse? That's all for today. Stay curious, stay questioning, and I'll see you in the next file.